Hello. Been a while, but yeah, so sorry. But been busy, blah, blah, blah. And haven't really had anything to make a video about. But now I do. I saw Das American Atheist's last video on the ontological argument. And I thought there was some stuff to say about it. The other video he made about it was good, or at least Anselm's version, because it is worth pointing out that it's supposed to be a devotional text. It's not meant to be an argument per se, right? It's meant to be devotional in the sense that he describes in that video, and I think that's important to bear in mind. So in some ways, I don't want to know why he made this video, because in some sense, it's weird to object to an argument on the basis of counter arguments after just talking about how the argument isn't supposed to be an argument in the first place. But that aside, I thought I'd kind of jump in and give a different perspective maybe on some of the things he says in the video. He gives three objections basically. Well, he gives some theological objections from Aquinas and others. Those I'm going to leave to the side because they're not super interesting to me. Well, they're interesting, but they're not. They don't really hurt the argument, I don't think, unless you're a Thomist. So the first real objection that he mentions is the island, the perfect island objection, and this comes from Gonolo, who was a monk in Anselm's time and who responded to Anselm's argument with a counter-argument about a perfect island, purporting to use Anselm's the same form of the argument and just substitute instead of the most perfect excuse me, being the most perfect island, and hence create a reductio of Anselm's argument. This objection has long been known to be faulty and really doesn't do much damage to Anselm's argument. And it's for a simple reason. The analogy fails to islands because islands are definitionally limited, right? An island has to be, for example, surrounded by water. It has to be, it can't be larger than, it has to be small enough to be surrounded completely by water. In other words, islands, in order to fit the definition of what an island is, don't need to have all possible greatnesses, all possible positive predicates, you could say. On the other hand, God, and at least this is what Anselm argues. You can reject this definition of God if you want, but this is the one that most people accept, and this is the one Anselm is dealing with. Is the greatest being imaginable, right? So such a being, A, is not limited by definition like an island is, and B, would seem to require all greatnesses, all positive predicates, in order to fulfill its definition. So in that sense, we're talking apples and oranges. The island argument, you're talking about something that's by definition limited. And so there's no need for an island to have every greatness, like existence. Whereas if you're talking about God would need to have every greatness. including existence, right? So for that reason, I think the island analogy is not plausible. Another objection that is mentioned in the video is the well, there's the Kant objection, but I'll get to that one last. The parity argument, the ontological argument for the non-existence of God or whatever, with the handicaps and the blah 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 blah. That's a really stupid argument. There's a ton of problems with it. One is just the first premise is just really easily rejectable. The creation of the world is the greatest feat imaginable, right? Something, whatever the first premise is, most marvelous achievement imaginable. That just strikes me as straightforwardly false. Depending on how we cash out the meaning of the term "the world," which Gasking doesn't. So here's one thing that would be more marvelous than the creation of the world. The creation of two worlds that were exactly like this one. And more marvelous than that would be 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 and 7 and 8 and 9. So the first premise I just reject. I'm also probably going to reject the third premise and maybe the second one also. Just because my intuitions don't go that way. I have no reason to think that the greater the disability of someone who does something, the better the achievement is, right? Maybe there's something else we can say about the achievement, but I don't think the impressiveness of the achievement goes up anymore, or the marvelousness. That's another problem with the argument. He slides back and forth between impressive, marvelous, yada yada yada. So that's sort of confusing. But I reject really premises 1, 2, and 3, and probably 4. 4 is just basically incoherent. So it's sort of a silly argument. Then there's the Kant thing. Existence is not. Oh, that's another problem with Gasking's argument is if you buy the Kant line that existence is not a predicate is a legitimate response to the ontological argument, well then you can't use Gasking's argument, because Gasking is saying that not that existence is a predicate, but that non-existence is a predicate, which is even more bizarre. And so that seems like a good reason to reject Gasking's argument, especially if you accept the Kantian line. And on the Kantian line, existence is not a predicate. First of all, that in and of itself is controversial, but that would be a whole other discussion that we don't need to have, because I don't think it applies to Anselm's argument anyway. Even if it does turn out to be true that existence isn't a predicate, I don't think that's what's going on in Anselm's argument. And other people have pointed this out, right? Plantinga points this out, and I think Norman Malcolm was probably the first to point this out. Norman Malcolm has a version of the ontological argument, which is basically Anselm's version, just with some cleaned up language. And he makes this point in his version, which no one ever talks about, by the way, or very few people, especially on YouTube. But it's really interesting, and it's a good version, I think. Malcolm's point is that, okay, existence isn't a predicate, that's fine, but what about necessary existence and contingent existence? Those things do seem to be better candidates for predicates, right? So existence, it's plausible. It's at least plausible, although still, like I said, controversial to say that no, existence isn't a predicate that things have, right? It's not a property that's instantiated in things. It's a a relationship between our thoughts and the world, or something like that, right? So the existence means we have a thought, and our thought refers to something out in the world. But when we start talking about necessary and contingent existence, we can't really make that move anymore. Because when we say, okay, well, there's this thing that exists, there's still a further question to be asked about that thing. Does it exist necessarily, i.e. in all possible worlds, or does it exist contingently, just in this world or in some subset of all possible worlds? And those two things sound much more like properties of the object, right? So is it the case that this object exists necessarily? To my mind, that's a property of the object. That's a predicate. And I think you'd have to put forward an argument to the contrary, because it's definitely not the case that contingent existence is some relationship between our thoughts and the world. It seems to be a fact about the world, right, or about certain objects in the world. And so the point is, Anselm's point is then that what we're talking about is necessary existence. His conclusion is that God necessarily exists. And I think if you read the argument carefully, that comes out. And like I said, a version like Malcolm's brings that out. So if you reject my interpretation of Anselm, then we can just talk about Malcolm's version, because it's the exact same thing, just with the stipulation that we're talking about necessary existence made explicit. So I think for those reasons, the three non-theological objections that Das American Atheist mentions against Anselm's ontological argument fail. Thanks.